There is a particular cruelty in the way history erases people. Not the cruelty of sudden violence, not the cruelty of war or famine, but the slow, deliberate cruelty of omission, the kind that happens in newspaper offices and publishing houses, in the back rooms of publicity agencies and the handshake agreements of powerful men. It is a cruelty that leaves no fingerprints because its primary instrument is silence, and silence, by definition, leaves no record of itself. Somewhere in the archives of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, buried beneath thousands of photographs, press releases and logbooks that document the golden age of American aviation, there is a poll. It was conducted in 1930, and it was not a trivial survey. It asked the nation's licensed pilots, the men and women who actually flew, who understood what it meant to push a machine made of metal and fabric and hope through the resistance of open air, to name the best female pilot in America. They did not name Amelia Earhart. They named Elinor Smith. Read that again and sit with it for a moment. Because if you know anything about the history of aviation in the 20th century, you know the name Amelia Earhart. You were taught it in school. You have seen it on postage stamps, on the sides of aircraft carriers, on the titles of biographical films. Amelia Earhart is without question one of the most recognizable names in American history, not just aviation history, not just women's history, but American history in the broadest, most foundational sense. And yet the pilots who flew alongside her, who competed against her, who watched her navigate the skies in the same open cockpit machines of the late 1920s and 1930s, those people, the people who actually knew what skill looked like from the inside of a cockpit, chose someone else. Someone who, by the time most of us were born, had been almost entirely removed from the popular historical record. Elinor Smith, born in 1909 in Rockaway Beach, New York, licensed to fly solo at 15 years of age, the holder of multiple altitude and endurance records, the pilot who at 17 flew beneath all 4 of the East River bridges in New York City in a single continuous run, a stunt so technically demanding that it was considered borderline suicidal by experienced aviators, the woman who, in her own memoir published in 1981, made the quietly devastating observation that Amelia Earhart was, in her professional assessment, more of a manufactured celebrity than an aviator. This is not a story about diminishing Amelia Earhart. Earhart was brave. Earhart was real. Earhart's disappearance over the Pacific in 1937 was a genuine tragedy, and the courage it took to attempt a circumnavigation of the globe in the aircraft of that era cannot be minimized. What this story is about is something more complex, and in some ways more troubling. The deliberate machinery of fame, and the way that machinery, operated by powerful men, driven by commercial interests, and enthusiastically amplified by a media culture that preferred its heroes singular and its stories clean, ground certain women to dust while elevating others, not based on ability, not based on achievement, based on something far more malleable and far more dishonest, based on marketability. This is the story of Elinor Smith, and of the world that made her and then unmade her. But it is also the story of Ruth Nichols, of Louise Tharden, of Florence Klingensmith, and of dozens of other women who flew extraordinary aircraft in an extraordinary decade and were repaid for their courage with obscurity. It is the story of what gets remembered and what gets erased, and why those two outcomes so rarely track what actually happened. And it begins, as so many forgotten stories do, in the middle of something magnificent. Part 2. Historical context and setting. To understand what Elinor Smith accomplished, and what it meant to accomplish it, you have to understand the decade into which she flew, and to understand that decade, you have to feel the particular electricity of the late 1920s in America, because the 1930s were not simply what came after the 1920s, they were what survived them. The 1920s had been a decade of almost delirious optimism, and nowhere was that optimism more concentrated than in the sky. Charles Lindbergh's solo crossing of the Atlantic in May of 1927, The 33.5-hour journey from Roosevelt Field on Long Island to Le Bourget Airfield outside Paris had not merely demonstrated that transatlantic flight was possible, it had, in a single act, transformed aviation from a novelty into a prophecy. Lindbergh landed in France to a crowd estimated at over 100,000 people, and the world he returned to was fundamentally different from the one he had left. The airplane was no longer a curiosity. It was the future, arriving ahead of schedule. In the months that followed Lucky Lindy's crossing, aviation became America's national obsession. Investment flooded into aircraft manufacturing. Barnstorming pilots who had previously scraped together livings performing at county fairs suddenly found themselves headlining international exhibitions. Every major city with a flat stretch of ground was constructing or expanding an airfield, and the newspapers, the great metropolitan dailies that served as the primary information medium for a nation of 120 million people, began printing aviation news the way they printed box scores, daily, compulsively, with the hunger of an audience that could not get enough. This was the world into which the celebrity aviator was born. Not as a pilot primarily, but as a character. A figure whose function was not simply to fly, but to embody something that the public needed to believe in. In the aftermath of the Great War, in the strange suspended animation between one catastrophe and the next, America needed its heroes. It needed proof that the human spirit could still transcend gravity, could still point itself at the horizon and go. Aviation gave them that proof, and the press gave them the aviators to worship. But the press needed something beyond mere competence. Competence was invisible at altitude. What the press needed was a story, and a story required a protagonist, and a protagonist required shaping. This is where the architecture of fame began to diverge from the architecture of achievement. By 1928, the year that Elinor Smith first made national headlines, the business of aviation celebrity had already developed its own distinct grammar. The ideal aviator hero was photogenic. The ideal aviator hero had a compelling origin narrative, preferably one that involved hardship overcome, destiny fulfilled, and the unmistakable aura of the exceptional individual rising above the ordinary crowd. The ideal aviator hero was also, particularly if female, positioned at a careful angle to conventional femininity, bold enough to be interesting, but not so transgressive as to alienate the mainstream reader. Too threatening and you lost the audience. Too conventional and you lost the story. Amelia Earhart understood this grammar, or more precisely, the people around her understood it on her behalf. George Putnam, the publisher and publicist who would eventually become her husband, recognized in Earhart not merely a competent aviator, but a legible American icon. She was photogenic in a lean, angular, quietly unconventional way. She had a Midwestern biography that read as authentic and unpretentious, and she wore her gender transgression with a particular lightness, a willingness to smile at the right moment, to say the reassuring thing, to inhabit the role of the pioneer without making the public feel accused by her pioneering. Putnam's management of Earhart's public image was, by any standard of the publicity craft, masterful. He arranged endorsements, speaking engagements, book deals, and film appearances. He cultivated relationships with newspaper editors and radio producers. He understood that fame in the age of mass media was not an organic phenomenon, it was a construction project, and it required constant maintenance. None of this is sinister in isolation. The machine Putnam built for Earhart was not fundamentally different from the machines built around any major celebrity of the era. The problem was what happened at the edges of that machine, because celebrity in a media environment with finite column inches and finite broadcast minutes is zero-sum. Every line devoted to Earhart was a line not devoted to someone else, and Putnam, who was nothing if not strategically minded, seems to have understood this clearly. The women who flew alongside Earhart, who competed against her in the nascent world of air racing and record-breaking, were not simply her contemporaries. In some cases, they were her superiors. And in the zero-sum economy of aviation celebrity, that made them her competition in a contest that was being fought not in the sky but on the front page. Elinor Smith never stood a chance in that contest. Not because she lacked ability, she had more of it than almost anyone in the country, but because she could not be contained within the grammar that the press and the publicity machine had agreed upon. She was too young, too frank, too technically specific in her assessments, and too unwilling to perform the soft-focus version of female heroism that the media apparatus required. She said what she thought. She was 17 years old, and she had the unguarded directness of someone who had not yet learned that honesty, in the business of fame, is a liability. Let us set the precise coordinates of history. The year is 1928. The United States is 9 months away from the stock market crash that will end one world and force another to begin. Aviation is, for this brief window, the nation's theater of dreams, and in October of that year, a 17-year-old girl from Rockaway Beach climbs into a Waco biplane and points it at the East River. Part 3. Key Figures and Events. Elinor Smith, the girl who flew beneath the bridges. Elinor Patricia Smith was born on August 17, 1909, the daughter of Tom Smith, a vaudeville performer and enthusiastic amateur aviator who had caught the flying bug in the earliest days of powered flight. This biographical detail matters more than it might initially appear, because it means that Elinor Smith did not come to aviation as an outsider pressing against the gate. She came from within it, carried on the current of her father's passion before she was old enough to understand what flying was. Tom Smith took his daughter to airfields the way other fathers took their children to baseball games. She sat beside pilots, listened to the technical conversations that flew above her head, and absorbed, through sheer proximity and duration of exposure, a vocabulary of flight that most people never acquire. By the time she was 10 years old, she had sat in the cockpit of more aircraft than most adults would encounter in a lifetime. She flew solo for the first time on a summer morning in 1922, when she was 10 years old, a fact that different sources record differently, with some placing the event at age 10 and others at a somewhat older age. But what is consistently documented is that she was flying before adolescence in any meaningful sense. By 1924, when she was 15, she had obtained her student pilot's license. She is believed to be the youngest licensed female pilot in American history up to that point. She received her full pilot's license at 16. At 17, she did something that no pilot, male or female, had ever done before. October 21st, 1928. The date is specific and documented. The East River runs between Manhattan and Queens, and in 1928 it was crossed by 4 low-spanning bridges: the Queensboro Bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, and the Brooklyn Bridge. These were not bridges built with clearance for aircraft. They were bridges built for road traffic and pedestrians and the occasional urban train, their lower decks hanging perhaps 30 or 40 feet above the water's surface, their spans and cables and structural ironwork creating a gauntlet of obstacles that would, at the speed required to maintain lift in a small aircraft, demand split-second precision at every moment. Elinor Smith flew beneath all 4 of them, in sequence, in a single continuous run. The stunt had been proposed originally as a dare, a bet in some accounts, offered by other pilots who assumed it was either impossible or suicidal. The aeronautics branch of the Department of Commerce did not share the general enthusiasm for the attempt. They suspended her pilot's license for 10 days after the event. Mayor Jimmy Walker of New York, who was many things including a man with a considerable gift for public theater, met with her after the license restoration and told her, according to contemporaneous press accounts, that she was the most skillful pilot he had ever seen perform in New York airspace. The newspapers covered the bridge run with exactly the mixture of awe and condescension that characterized the era's relationship with women who did extraordinary things. She was described variously as a girl daredevil, a teenage aviatrix, and, in one particularly revealing formulation from a New York tabloid, a slip of a girl who seems to have no notion of the limits proper to her sex. That last phrase is worth examining carefully because it tells you something essential about the lens through which the press was viewing her. The accomplishment was undeniable. The technical skill required was not in dispute. What the press was uncertain about, what made the story both irresistible and vaguely threatening, was how to categorize someone who had done something that men twice her age would not attempt. The answer, ultimately, was to sensationalize the youth and the gender, and to minimize the craft. To cover the bridge run not as a demonstration of extraordinary technical skill, but as a youthful stunt, the aeronautical equivalent of a teenager running a red light. It was spectacular enough to put her on the front page, but the framing ensured she stayed there as a novelty rather than ascending to the status of a serious aviator. She did not accept that framing. This may have been her most consequential mistake in the political economy of aviation celebrity because it made her difficult to manage and easy to marginalize. The record years 1929 and 1930. The years 1929 and 1930 were, in terms of raw achievement, the apex of Elinor Smith's career. She was 20 years old and operating at a level that, by any objective measure, placed her at or near the top of American aviation. In 1929, she set 3 aviation records in a single calendar year. She set a new women's solo endurance record, remaining aloft for over 13 hours in a sustained flight that required not only physical stamina, but the kind of metabolic and mechanical management that long-duration aviation demands. She set a women's speed record, and she set a women's altitude record, climbing to 27,419 feet, a height at which the air is so thin that a pilot without proper oxygen equipment loses consciousness within minutes, and where the cold can incapacitate exposed skin faster than most people in the warm cabins of the era could imagine. Each of these records was documented, certified, and reported, and yet in each case the reporting was subordinate to the larger cultural narrative that was already forming around aviation, a narrative with one female protagonist and precious little room for another. The 1930 poll is the most striking single data point. The Aeronautical Chamber of Commerce, a body of licensed professional pilots, the people who actually occupied cockpits for a living, voted Elinor Smith the best female pilot in America. This was not a popularity contest. This was not a newspaper survey of readers who had never sat in an aircraft. This was the professional community of aviation, using the evaluative framework of their actual expertise, rendering a judgment. Elinor Smith recalled this episode in her memoir, Aviatrix, published in 1981, with a mixture of pride and rueful awareness of how little it ultimately mattered in the competition that actually determined who would be remembered. The vote gave her no significant boost in press coverage. It generated no endorsement deals, no lecture circuit invitations, no film offers. It did not reshape the narrative, because the narrative by 1930 had already been written. There is a letter, quoted in secondary historical accounts of the period, in which Elinor Smith's mother wrote to a booking agency attempting to secure speaking engagements for her daughter. The agency replied that while they found Miss Smith's record of achievement most impressive, they had found that the public's appetite for female aviation speakers was currently adequately satisfied. The language is almost comically self-revealing in its transparency. The public appetite for female aviation speakers was not, in fact, adequately satisfied. It was satisfied by a single speaker, the demand having been effectively monopolized. George Putnam's management of Earhart's career included, by multiple contemporaneous accounts, an active effort to crowd out potential competitors from the major aviation events, speaking circuits, and endorsement opportunities that Earhart's growing celebrity was opening up. Whether this constituted deliberate blacklisting in any coordinated sense is difficult to establish from the historical record alone, and this essay will not assert certainty where uncertainty remains, but the pattern of outcomes is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. Elinor Smith in Aviatrix is direct about her own perception. She believed that Putnam had worked systematically to undermine her access to the same commercial opportunities that Earhart enjoyed. "There was a kind of invisible gate," she wrote, in a passage that deserves quotation in full. "You could see the runway from where you stood. You could hear the engines. You knew exactly what you would do if you got out there. But getting to the gate was the problem, and the gate was controlled by someone who had decided, long before you arrived, that there was only room for one of us." Ruth Nichols, the woman who broke 3 records and was forgotten anyway. Elinor Smith was not alone in her erasure. The broader landscape of 1930s female aviation was populated with women of extraordinary accomplishment who existed outside the frame of popular historical memory. Ruth Rowland Nichols was born in New York City in 1901, the daughter of a stockbroker, and she obtained her pilot's license in 1924 at Curtis Field, becoming one of the first licensed female pilots in New York State. By 1930, she had set a women's world speed record, flying at 210.7 miles per hour. By 1931, she had set a women's altitude record of 28,743 feet, exceeding, at that moment, all records set by women in the world. She also set a women's transcontinental speed record, crossing the United States faster than any woman had done before. 3 world records. In 1 year, Ruth Nichols attempted to fly the Atlantic solo in 1931, the year that Earhart successfully completed the crossing. Nichols crashed on takeoff in New Brunswick, Canada, sustaining serious injuries including 5 fractured vertebrae. She spent months in a spinal cast. When she recovered, she returned to aviation. She spent the remainder of the decade flying, breaking additional records, and working in commercial aviation. She founded Relief Wings, a non-profit organization that provided emergency air transportation for disaster relief, a genuinely consequential humanitarian contribution that predated the systematic use of aircraft for emergency medical response by decades. Ruth Nichols died in 1960. Her death was reported in the newspapers, with the kind of brief, dutiful notice reserved for figures who had once been known and were no longer. In 2024, she remains almost entirely absent from the popular historical consciousness. Louise Tharden, the pilot who actually won. If the story of erased female aviation contains a single fact most revealing of the machinery at work, it may be this one. In 1936, Louise Tharden won the Bendix Trophy race, one of the most prestigious aviation competitions in America, defeating every male competitor in the country. Louise McFetridge Tharden was born in Bentonville, Arkansas, in 1905. She learned to fly in 1927 and obtained her transport license, the highest category of commercial pilot certification, shortly thereafter. In 1928, she set a women's altitude record of 20,260 feet. In 1929, she set a women's endurance record of 22 hours and 3 minutes. In that same year, she won the inaugural Women's Air Derby, the coast-to-coast air race that the press, with characteristic condescension, immediately nicknamed the Powder Puff Derby, a name that persisted in popular usage for decades despite the strenuous objection of its participants. Then came 1936. The Bendix Trophy was the most important long-distance air race in the country, running from New York to Los Angeles. It was open to male and female pilots alike, though no woman had ever come close to winning the overall competition. Louise Tharden won it. She won it outright, ahead of all the men, completing the transcontinental distance in 14 hours, 55 minutes and 1 second at an average speed of 165.3 miles per hour. Tharden was accompanied by her navigator, Blanche Noyes, herself a pilot of considerable accomplishment, and together they crossed the country faster than every male pilot who had entered the race. It was, by any reasonable standard, one of the most significant achievements in American aviation of the decade. Press coverage of the victory was extensive in the immediate aftermath, and then it faded, as press coverage tends to fade, and Tharden's place in the popular historical record faded with it. She published a memoir, High, Wide and Frightened, in 1938, which was well received and then gradually went out of print and out of mind. She died in 1979. Today she is known primarily to aviation historians and enthusiasts, the people who, by virtue of their specific obsession, have gone looking for the stories that the general historical record chose not to keep. Florence Klingensmith, the record-setter who paid the ultimate price. Some of the women erased from aviation history were erased because their achievements were inconvenient. Florence Klingensmith was erased because her death was. Florence Klingensmith was a Fargo, North Dakota native who taught herself to fly after repeatedly watching aircraft at the local airfield and deciding, with the kind of determined lateral thinking that characterized many of the early aviators, that she could do it herself. She barnstormed across the Midwest, performed aerial stunts at county fairs, and accumulated an aviation record that by the early 1930s had established her as one of the most skilled aerobatic pilots in the country, male or female. In August of 1933, she entered the Phillips Trophy race at Chicago's Century of Progress Exposition, a race that was, by its very structure, an assertion of equality. Men and women competed together, in the same aircraft, under the same conditions. Klingensmith was flying a GB Model Y, one of the most demanding and unforgiving racing aircraft ever built, a machine so prone to aerodynamic instability that experienced pilots approached it with the respect usually reserved for explosives. During the race, a piece of the aircraft's fabric detached. In attempting to manage the resulting aerodynamic emergency, Klingensmith lost control. She went down. She did not survive. The press coverage of her death focused, as press coverage of women's aviation accidents consistently did, on the gender dimension of the tragedy, the implicit suggestion that women who flew such machines were tempting a fate they had not been designed to resist. The coverage did not engage seriously with her record of achievement. It did not record the specific technical circumstances of the crash with the same forensic seriousness applied to male pilots who died in racing aircraft. It absorbed her death into a pre-existing narrative about the inherent inadvisability of women in high-performance aviation, and then moved on. Florence Klingensmith has no entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica. She has a small entry in aviation enthusiast databases. She has a monument in Fargo that most people who pass it have never stopped to read. Wheeler Brown, Flying While Black in the 1930s. Any account of erased female aviators in the 1930s that does not grapple with Wheeler Brown is an account that has reproduced, through its own omission, the very pattern it is attempting to document. Wheeler Beatrice Brown was born in Glasgow, Kentucky in 1906, and she grew up in Indiana. She was at the intersection of her race and her gender, operating in a space that the aviation world of the 1930s had constructed as doubly inaccessible. The 99s, the organization of licensed female pilots founded in 1929 with Amelia Earhart as its first president, was effectively segregated. Black women who wished to learn to fly faced the combined resistance of Jim Crow aviation policies and the gender barriers that their white counterparts were already struggling to overcome. Wheeler Brown surmounted both. She obtained her private pilot's license in 1938, becoming one of the first black women licensed to fly in the United States. She went on to obtain her commercial license and her master mechanic's certificate, a credential that required not merely flying competence, but deep technical knowledge of aircraft engineering. She co-founded the Coffey School of Aeronautics in Chicago with her partner Cornelius Coffey, an institution that would train hundreds of black pilots during and after the Second World War, including several of the men who would become the Tuskegee Airmen. Wheeler Brown lobbied Congress. She testified before committees, she wrote letters, made arguments, and used every tool available to a black woman operating in the political system of 1930s America to push for the integration of military aviation. She was, by any measure, not only a remarkable aviator but a consequential political actor whose specific advocacy contributed to the eventual opening of military aviation to black Americans. She died in 1992. Most Americans who were alive at that time did not know her name. most Americans alive today still do not. Part 4. Deeper Patterns and Analysis. The Architecture of Forgetting. The erasure of Elinor Smith and her contemporaries was not accidental. To say it was accidental would be to misunderstand how institutional forgetting works, and to misunderstand that is to miss the most important thing about this history. Forgetting, in the historical sense, does not happen by itself. It requires active maintenance. It requires the repeated choice, made at every level of the information ecosystem, in newsrooms, in publishing houses, in school curriculum committees, in the production meetings of documentary filmmakers, to allocate attention in some directions rather than others. Each of these choices is individually defensible. No single editor who spiked a story about Ruth Nichols in favor of another Earhart feature was consciously participating in a conspiracy against the historical record. He was simply making a practical decision about what his readers wanted, what his advertisers supported, and what the prevailing cultural grammar of his moment allowed him to print. But the cumulative effect of 10,000 individually defensible choices is a historical record that looks, in aggregate, as though it was deliberately constructed to minimize the achievements of women who were not Amelia Earhart, and to render invisible the achievements of women who were black, which is, functionally, what it is. The historian Claudia Oakes, writing in her essential 1981 study, United States Women in Aviation, 1930 to 1939, documented the systematic underrepresentation of female aviators in the primary historical records of the period. She found that women who set records in this era were consistently given shorter column inches than male pilots who set equivalent or lesser records, that their coverage more frequently included personal and biographical information at the expense of technical detail, and that the framing of their achievements was more likely to emphasize the surprising or transgressive nature of a woman doing these things rather than the specific content of what they had done. The effect, accumulated across thousands of articles over a decade, was to position female aviation as an ongoing sociological curiosity rather than a field of genuine technical achievement, which meant that the women who participated in it were consistently categorized as novelties rather than professionals. This matters for a specific reason. Novelties do not generate institutional legacies. Professionals do. The pilot, who is covered as a technical innovator, becomes a figure around whom aviation historians build scholarship, around whom documentarians structure narratives, around whom museum curators organize exhibitions. The pilot, who is covered as an amusing anomaly, a girl who flies planes, isn't that something, becomes a footnote, and a footnote, repeated enough times, eventually disappears entirely. George Putnam understood all of this, which is precisely what made him such an effective operator. He understood that fame was not merely the sum of an individual's accomplishments, but the institutional infrastructure built around those accomplishments, the book deals, the endorsements, the speaking circuit, the educational materials, the museum donations, the corporate partnerships. He built that infrastructure for Earhart with extraordinary competence, and in doing so he ensured that when the history of female aviation was eventually written, it would be written around a figure whose institutional legacy was robust and well documented, rather than around figures whose records existed in scattered logbooks and half-forgotten newspaper archives. The Putnam problem. What we can and cannot know. It is important to be precise about what the historical evidence actually supports regarding George Putnam's role in the eclipse of women like Elinor Smith. Aviatrix, Smith's 1981 memoir, is a primary source of considerable value, but it is also a memoir, which is to say it is one person's account of events filtered through decades of memory and the natural inclinations of personal narrative. Smith's characterization of Putnam as having actively worked to block her career advancement represents her sincere conviction, and it is a conviction supported by circumstantial evidence that the historian cannot dismiss. But it is not the same as documentary proof of coordinated interference. What the historical record does support, with considerably more certainty, is the structural reality of the situation, that Putnam's management of Earhart's career created a commercial and media environment in which Earhart's celebrity was self-reinforcing, and in which any other female aviator who aspired to equivalent visibility was competing not merely against Earhart, but against the entire infrastructure Putnam had built. Whether Putnam actively worked to exclude Smith from specific opportunities, or whether Smith was excluded from those opportunities simply because the machinery of Earhart's celebrity consumed all available oxygen, the outcome was the same. This distinction matters philosophically even when it does not matter practically. Because if the erasure of Elinor Smith was the result of deliberate interference by a specific powerful individual, then it is a story about villainy, and stories about villainy are, in a paradoxical sense, easier to absorb than the alternative. Villainy implies an exception, a departure from the normal functioning of things. The alternative, that Smith was erased by the perfectly normal functioning of a media and commercial system that simply had no structural mechanism for accommodating more than one female aviation celebrity at a time, is a more uncomfortable story, because it means the system was working exactly as designed and that the design itself was the problem. Elinor Smith, for her part, seems to have intuited both possibilities simultaneously. Her memoir contains passages of genuine outrage at specific individuals and specific decisions, and it contains passages of more structural analysis that suggest she understood the systemic dimension of what had happened to her. She was writing 50 years after the fact, with the advantage of historical perspective and the freedom of someone who had survived long enough to say plainly what she thought. She lived, it is worth noting, until 2010. She was 100 years old. She spent the last decade of her life doing occasional interviews, making occasional public appearances, accepting the belated recognition that comes to historically significant figures who live long enough for the historical significance to be rediscovered. In 2000, she flew an F-15 simulation at Moffett Federal Airfield, not, in this case, as a publicity stunt, but as a demonstration offered by pilots who simply wanted to see whether a woman who had set altitude records in 1930 could still think like an aviator. She performed brilliantly, according to the engineers and military pilots present. She was 91 years old. Why singularity is dangerous? The one narrative problem, the structural problem that generated Elinor Smith's erasure, the problem of a cultural and commercial system that could only accommodate a single female aviation celebrity at one time, is not a problem specific to aviation in the 1930s. It is a recurring feature of how societies handle the transgression of categorical boundaries. When women entered any field dominated by men in the first half of the 20th century, the social system's typical response was not to revise the category, but to admit a single exception. The one woman who was permitted to enter was then positioned, necessarily, in a relationship of competitive singularity with other women who wished to follow, because the system had not adjusted its fundamental assumption that this was by default a male domain, but had merely created one opening. The women competing for that opening were not competing on the same terms as men competing in the same field. They were competing for a single slot in a zero-sum economy of exception. This created dynamics that were corrosive in multiple directions. It pitted women against each other for access to visibility in ways that men in the same field were not pitted against each other. It created a situation in which the woman who obtained the single available slot had an interest, whether conscious or not, in maintaining her singularity, because if the slot expanded into a general category, her specific celebrity would be diluted, and it ensured that the women who did not obtain the slot would be erased, regardless of their actual achievement, because the system had no mechanism for preserving the record of those it had not chosen to celebrate. Amelia Earhart was not the agent of this system. She was, in important ways, its product and its victim, a woman whose genuine courage and considerable accomplishment were instrumentalized by a commercial apparatus that was using her celebrity to sell aircraft, aviation fuel, luggage, and the general idea of American possibility. The version of Earhart that was marketed to the public was a simplified, commercialized, carefully managed version of a person who was, by all accounts of those who knew her well, considerably more complicated, more technically engaged, and more politically conscious than the icon permitted. But the fact that Earhart was also simplified by the machinery of her own celebrity does not erase the structural reality that her elevation was achieved at a cost paid, in significant part, by women like Elinor Smith and Ruth Nichols and Louise Thaden, women whose achievements were real and whose erasure was not. The technical record as corrective, here is what the flight logs say: stripped of the celebrity apparatus, stripped of the media framing, stripped of everything except the numbers that exist in the archives. In 1929, Elinor Smith held the women's world altitude record. She held the women's world endurance record. She held the women's world speed record. She had set these records not in a single spectacular flight, as Lindbergh's Atlantic crossing had been spectacular, but through systematic, technically demanding work, through the kind of rigorous, methodical engagement with the limits of aviation technology that serious pilots know is the real work of record setting. In 1930, the Professional Pilots of America voted her the best female pilot in the country. In 1931, Ruth Nichols set a women's altitude record of 28,743 feet, higher than Smith's previous record, higher than any woman had ever flown. In 1936, Louise Thaden won the Bendix Trophy, defeating every male competitor in the nation's most prestigious air race. These facts did not, in aggregate, produce a historical record that reflected them. They produced a historical record in which Amelia Earhart was the only female aviator most Americans could name, a situation that persisted for decades after the death of every principal involved, that was passed down through textbooks and documentaries and museum exhibitions as though it represented the actual shape of female aviation achievement in the 1930s, rather than the shape of George Putnam's publicity operation. The flight logs do not lie. The records do not lie. The polls do not lie. History, on the other hand, the public historical record, the popular account of the past that societies carry forward into their self-understanding, lies constantly, not through the fabrication of false events, but through the systematic selection of which true events to carry and which to leave behind. Part 5. Modern Implications and Questions. What the erased tell us about what we keep. There is a question that runs beneath this entire history and surfaces, eventually, in every mind that follows it to the end. The question is not merely about aviation. It is about the nature of historical knowledge itself, and what that knowledge, in its current, received form, actually tells us. We believe, most of us, that history preserves the most important things. We believe that the figures who appear in our textbooks, who give their names to airports and scholarships and federal programs, who look out at us from the faces of postage stamps, we believe these figures are there because they did something that genuinely merits the permanence we have assigned to them. We believe, in other words, that the historical record is a meritocracy. Elinor Smith's story, and Ruth Nichols' story, and Louise Thaden's story, and Willa Brown's story is a direct refutation of that belief. These women did not fail to meet the bar. The bar was moved, repeatedly, in ways calibrated to keep them below it. And the mechanism by which the bar was moved was not primarily the explicit, legible violence of prohibition, the laws that said women could not do this, the regulations that formally excluded them from that. It was the subtler, less legible mechanism of narrative control, the power to decide which achievements were covered and which were not, the power to frame what was covered in ways that minimized its significance, the power to build around certain figures and not others, the institutional infrastructure that converts temporary fame into durable historical legacy. These powers were held in the 1930s almost entirely by men, not because of any formal rule, but because the institutions through which those powers were exercised, the newspapers, the publishing houses, the aviation associations, the commercial sponsorship networks, were staffed and led predominantly by men who shared a set of cultural assumptions about what female achievement meant and how it should be contextualized. They were not, most of them, consciously malicious. They were simply operating within the assumptions of their moment, making the individually defensible choices that added up, in aggregate, to the systematic erasure of an entire generation of accomplished women. And here is where the modern implication becomes impossible to avoid. If this happened in a field as thoroughly documented as aviation, in a decade as thoroughly studied as the 1930s, with achievements as specifically quantifiable as flight records, if the erasure was this complete in circumstances this favorable to preservation, what happened in the fields that were less thoroughly documented? What happened to the women whose achievements left no records in national archives, no certifications filed with government agencies, no logbooks preserved by aviation historians? The answer is that we do not know. And the reason we do not know is the reason Elinor Smith is not in most history textbooks, because the mechanisms that produced knowledge also produced ignorance selectively in directions that consistently disadvantage people who were already disadvantaged by gender and race and class. The particular loneliness of the recovered story. There is something worth naming about the emotional texture of this kind of historical recovery. The experience of learning in the 21st century about a woman who flew higher and faster than anyone else in 1930 and was voted the best in the country by her professional peers, and yet vanished from the historical record as completely as if she had never existed. The feeling is not primarily outrage. Outrage is a response to a villain, to an identifiable agent of injustice whom we can confront and accuse. The feeling produced by Elinor Smith's story is closer to grief, and it is grief of a particular, recursive quality. Grief not only for what she lost, but for what we lost, and for the fact that we did not know we had lost it. Grief for the generations of girls who grew up in the second half of the 20th century, knowing only one female aviation pioneer, knowing only Amelia Earhart, as if the sky had made room for only one woman, as if the record books had filled themselves with a single name through the natural operation of merit, and who were therefore given a smaller idea of what was possible than the actual historical truth supported. Elinor Smith knew, presumably, what she had achieved. She lived with that knowledge for 100 years. She wrote about it in 1981. She gave interviews late in her life that were attended with the respectful, slightly baffled attention that the media tends to direct at anyone who has lived to an extraordinary age and has a story to tell that most people have not heard. She does not seem, in the accounts of those who met her in her final decades, to have been a bitter person. She seems to have been a person who had made peace with what happened to her without pretending that it was fair. That particular combination, clear-eyed recognition of the injustice without consuming bitterness, is itself a kind of achievement. It is not the achievement she would have chosen, but it is real. The structures we have inherited, the machinery that erased Elinor Smith, did not dismantle itself in 1940. It evolved. It adapted to new technologies, new media forms, new cultural vocabularies, but the underlying structure, the concentration of narrative power in institutions, staffed by people whose assumptions about who mattered had been formed in a particular cultural moment and were slow to revise, that structure persisted for longer than most of us would like to believe. The women's aviation history that was recovered, beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1990s and 2000s, was recovered largely through the efforts of people who went looking for it deliberately, historians who had decided, against the grain of the received record, that the gap between what the popular historical account claimed and what the primary sources showed was too large to be explained by mere accident. The gap, as they discovered when they looked closely enough, was the size of a generation of women who had flown. The scholarship produced by Claudia Oakes, by Joseph Korn in his 1983 study, The Winged Gospel, Americans and the Airplane, by Kathleen Brooks Pasmany in her work on women pilots, and by a generation of aviation historians who followed them. This scholarship exists. It is available. It has been for decades. And yet the popular historical memory has been slow to absorb it, because popular historical memory is not primarily updated by scholarship. It is updated by culture, by films and television series and museum blockbuster exhibitions, and the kinds of biographical narratives that make it into standardized curricula. That process of cultural updating is underway. It is incomplete, and it is uneven, and it tends to focus on the figures whose stories are most narratively available, whose documentation is richest, whose surviving descendants are most engaged, whose stories have the most dramatic shape. Elinor Smith, who lived to 100 and wrote her own memoir and gave her own interviews, is better positioned than most to make that transition. Ruth Nichols, who died in circumstances that her family long described as ambiguous and whose records are scattered, is less so. Willa Brown, whose story sits at the intersection of race and gender and the particular violence that American history has done to both, is perhaps the most in need of sustained cultural recovery. A final question. There is a test proposed by the philosopher and historian of science Naomi Oreskes that asks us to examine the structure of any received historical narrative and ask whose absence is invisible. Not whose absence has been noted and mourned and documented, but whose absence has been so complete and so normalized that we have not even noticed there is an absence to mourn. In the history of aviation, the answer was Elinor Smith, for longer than any of us should find comfortable. And in the history of countless other fields, medicine, literature, mathematics, architecture, jurisprudence, music, the answer is still being constructed by the scholars and researchers who are doing, right now, the same kind of archival work that recovered Smith and Nichols and Thaden, the work of going back to the primary sources and asking, with genuine openness to whatever the answer turns out to be, who was actually there. What they find, consistently, is that the past was more crowded than the received historical record allows, that the sky had room for more than one woman after all, that the story we told ourselves was not the story that happened, but the story that the architecture of power produced from what happened, a filtered version, a curated version, a version edited for an audience that the editors had decided, consciously or not, was more comfortable with a simplified world. History is not a photograph. It is a selection, and every selection involves a selector, and every selector has a position, a set of assumptions, a particular view of who matters and who does not, that shapes what they choose to keep and what they allow to fall away. Elinor Smith flew beneath all 4 East River bridges on October 21, 1928. She was 17 years old. She held the women's altitude, endurance, and speed records in 1929. The pilots of America voted her the best female pilot in the country in 1930. She lived for 100 years and remembered every flight. The sky remembered her too, even if the history books did not. The question, the one this story leaves open, the one that follows the listener out of this essay and into whatever remains of their day, is not why Elinor Smith was forgotten. We know why she was forgotten. The question is what else we have forgotten, whose names we do not yet know well enough to miss, whose logbooks are sitting in some archive in a folder that no one has thought to open. The question is who is still erased, and whether we are, right now, doing the work required to find them. This is the lost timeline. The record is never complete. The search continues.